you know, I'm a deal lawyer, and someone said to me last night, make sure you understand, or that you explain to people, because they won't necessarily understand what M&A means. I'm an M&A lawyer. Have been for 30 years, primarily to entrepreneurial industry and undertakings. M&A means mergers and acquisitions, for those of you that don't already know that. Don't mean to belabor the obvious, but so when I say M&A, I'm talking about the widest possible range of acquisition and disposition of not only businesses but assets. So as an M&A lawyer, we're involved in, I can tell you, I've been involved in hundreds of acquisitions and dispositions over the last 30 years, and they have run a wide gamut of industries: tech industries, software, development companies, medical. I represented the largest radiology group in the greater Houston area, and we did M&A work, acquired surgery centers with doctors and dispositions to hospitals. I've done oil and gas firm acquisitions and dispositions, property acquisitions and dispositions. Just sort of run the gamut. Service businesses, intellectual property businesses, where the primary assets were developed patents or trade secret type processes that were critical elements of the cash flow stream in the business and therefore represented the real value in the business. Where I'm going with this is to say to you today, I didn't come to talk to you about how RREAF does a deal or how a RREAF deal works and what we do. That's a discussion for another day. What I wanted you guys to hear today that I thought was really important from my perspective as general counsel of this company is that you all understand that what we do on a day-to-day basis here is a tiny little sliver of a much wider mergers and acquisitions process that goes on every single day in business. Let me give you an example, and this is a critical piece of what we're going to talk about here today. We can view mergers and acquisitions, a property acquisition, a multifamily acquisition, a hotel, a hospitality acquisition, as the acquisition of an operating business. Now, we tend to see it as an acquisition of a property, right? I mean, those of us, inside the shop, we're all thinking, okay, we're going to buy this property and then we're going to operate it. We're buying an operating business. The only reason we buy it is because it's already existing and it has a cash flow stream. We think we can do better with it. But we're buying an operating business. This is exactly what private equity firms around the world do every single day. They buy operating businesses. They might not be operating well. In fact, they don't want them to be operating particularly well because they can create wealth and value by finding ways to operate them better, combine them with other industries or groups or other pieces that as a portfolio, those companies together will have some synergy across customer bases and the like and produce greater revenue streams without having to increase as much in overhead or in variable cost. So I wanted us to hear sort of steps of an M&A from a wider perspective that would be general to just about any acquisition. And these are going to be broad steps. We're going to take 15 minutes to talk about this. We're not going to take 4 days because I can show you, we have CLE tracks where literally we're doing anatomy of a deal for M&A guys, anatomy of a deal and digging down into the details, that they're literally a year's worth of monthly day-long seminars. So we're going to just really hit high-level overview at this point, but this is our starting point because I think all of the experts that we have both in the shop and people outside the shop who are our consultants and advisors over the course of the next year or two, we'll have, I think, all of our departmental heads up here speaking about a particular element of what they do in their particular division and how that fits into this global discussion we're going to have today about M&A in general. We will try to tie in where RREAF, and you'll see this as you go, and all of you know how we do what we do generally, And so you'll see where some of these pieces, an entire part of our acquisition, you're going to see in one of the slides today, an entire part of an acquisition that takes us months and months and months of work is subsumed within a single line in my presentation today. Okay? I'm not minimizing the importance of that. I'm rather trying to stay at a very high level so that we see this as a larger process, as a wider process. So having said that, let's start in and talk, and let's go to the first slide. There you go, and you should be able to follow this on your, on your handout generally. And I'll try not to bore you by simply saying what's already on the handout, but we'll use it as a go-by. Every deal, irrespective of whether we would characterize it as an asset acquisition or the target acquisition of a company in the form of a stock acquisition or a merger or some other method by which we bring that company or that business into the fold, irrespective of that, we're going to see these fundamental elements, these steps in every single deal. I can tell you from having done lots of these things, and I'm assuming that TJ and those of you who are in asset will probably agree with this. Although those of us who are in the front end of mergers and acquisitions deals, guys like Chris and me and the Staghorn guys who do finance and that sort of thing, we tend to be guys who, or ladies who, we do all of this work up front to make sure that we get to a closing, which is item 4 on the list. And once we've gotten to the closing, we've delivered that thing. We've delivered the baby over to the acquirer. Yeah, right. Kind of those of us, other than a little bit of post-closing work, those of us that are in that part of the acquisition team, we're kind of like, okay, done. There's a little bit of post-closing closure for us, and then we're on to the next one, right? Somebody has to take that baby and do something with it. And my experience, although I don't do that as part of the work that I do for a living and never have, I can tell you that the people who actually do that, they're left with taking care of the baby 24/7, 365 for a while. That is the hardest part of the M&A business as a business. That is integration. It's easy to buy something. It's real hard if you're already in that business and you already have all your own culture and processes and everything else to bring a new acquisition in that has its own employees and team and prior management and all that sort of stuff, make the hard decisions about who stays, who goes, and then make the really hard decisions about how we're going to transition over to new accounting systems and banking systems and processes and procedures and those sorts of things. Because that transition's critical to the survival of that baby and bringing it into the fold so that from a reporting perspective, which every growing organization has to deal with, as a reporting, we have the ability to transition in and not have hiccups. So every deal is different. And I know if you walk away with one thing today, I want you to walk away from the notion that this is a wider view of a process, but that even inside the process, even an acquisition of one multifamily property versus another one, those two deals are different. And not for the obvious reasons that they're different properties. They truly are coming to the table with different sellers, with different negotiation strategy. Those of you who are involved in the finance side of it know that the economics turn based on what the capital stack looks like, which lender it is, what type of lending program we're in. Every single thing is different. Many of us are not down in the weeds enough in the acquisition side. Chris certainly it is, and we do this from a lawyer's perspective. We're digging through things like, what are the permits that are required? Is the local jurisdiction going to be a problem on a particular issue? We get into the restaurant business. We're doing this with Southlake. If you're going to have a bar or a restaurant, you have to have a what? A liquor license, right? Every single jurisdiction is different. Every jurisdiction is different. Environmentally, although we have EPA and federal environmental safe water standards and all those sorts of things, environmental rules are different from one state to the next. Sales tax, use tax, property tax, those sorts of things, they differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Income tax. income tax reporting, and those sorts of things. So even though we're in a business where we only really work in 2 or 3 sub-phases of our industry, don't go to sleep on an acquisition. Don't. It'll be the worst thing you do. Do not allow our acquisitions to make you fall asleep. Don't look at this checklist, and I've given you an example of a checklist of a multifamily property acquisition, okay? And there's lots of small print. We're not going through that today, but I wanted to give you an acquisition checklist of the kind of things that as lawyers or as acquirers in general, we'd be ticking through that list trying to make sure that we didn't miss an issue along the way. Because it's not the ones you know about, it's the ones you don't know about that'll hurt you, as I said, and as we said in our introduction to this when we sent out the invitation email. It's what you don't know that gets you. It's not what you do know. So that's why don't get comfortable with what you do know. Be uncomfortable that you don't know, and then go find it. That's the key to good acquisition work. So we have what I refer to as the prelude. Let's go to the next slide, please. The prelude is where Graham and the acquisition team really sort of live their lives. Depending upon whether you're the buyer or the seller, the prelude is very different. In the prelude, the seller is trying to get their company ready, whether it's a property ready or an operating business. They're trying to clean it all up, trying to make it look all nice and fancy. We use it sometimes, especially in the oil and gas business where we're a little crass, we say, put some lipstick on the pig, okay? We want to kind of clean it up and make it look all nice, and records are together. We'll go out and do an early diligence box, but, you know, we don't have everything in it. We have a secondary box where we've got, you know, the whole ball of wax in it. And you begin to do sort of the dance. I call this the dance, right? We find out, well, property's available or an acquisition target's available. And so, hey, would you be interested in that? Well, I don't know. We got to look at that internally. And we look at, and here at RREAF, we do it through our IC. We sort of, and Graham and the team are pulling property opportunities in. Beth and others are looking at this, the early detail that you can even find out about it, things that are available on the market, in the market, that you don't have to have a confidentiality agreement for. You don't already have to be inside the house, behind the curtain, so to speak. You have to do all that early stuff to ferret out the 100 deals, to ferret out the 1 or 2 deals you really want to sit down here at IC and talk about. You got to go through a whole bunch of stuff, junk, to get to the real deals. And so that process in itself is an ongoing process. It never ends. In a company that's growing like we are and are trying to do, we truly, and I regard us as really wider than this, but a sub-scale or a sub-component of what I would call private equity. We are raising money from the outside and investing that money and borrowing money to acquire operating businesses, portfolioize them, sell them off for greater value, those sorts of things. That's what PE does every single day. That's what they do for a living. They just do it in other industries. Although Mosaic's an example of a real estate PE company. Pennybacker is an example of a real estate PE company, as far as I'm concerned, private equity company. So what we see along the way is that the sellers, and I refer to those as targets in the M&A business, we call that the target, the property or the acquisition target. The seller is trying to get ready. At the same time, the buyers are out there combing the market for opportunities before they hit the market, right? At the same time, the seller recognizes he's got to have a bidding process to get the most out of his money, to get the most out of his deal. And in a typical M&A scenario, you'll hire a broker, a business broker, or someone even wider than that. If it's a big enough target, if it's $1 billion target, you have big underwriters out there and all kinds of deal people putting fancy offering documents together. A lot of times there's confidentiality and all kinds of things already out there. In publicly traded companies, there are things you can't say. So you have to be very careful about how you announce and all those sorts of things. So that's a completely different kind of market. But people are getting ready. The seller's getting ready. And the buyers are getting ready all the time because they're doing what we do every day. And that is our finance guys at Staghorn are always looking for sources of capital, On the equity side, we're always looking for sources of equity capital, right? We're not just looking for deals into which we can put that capital to work. So this is Prelude. And then what will happen is the seller will put out some sort of marketing information, some sort of announcement, and they're called various things in various industries that'll let the world know, hey, we're offering this property. It just might go up on an MLS or on some big broker's site or something like that. And then the buyers who've been combing through this stuff will sort of filter in. There may be an LOI. There may not be an LOI. There may be a preliminary indication of interest that's even what I would refer to as a limited or soft LOI. Depends on the business. We tend to go right straight to LOIs, and then beyond that, we go straight to a PSA. Now, in a larger M&A deal, what we'll do is we'll get LOIs. The seller will get down to maybe 4 or 5 interested parties, and they will then sign up confidentiality agreements. That the confidentiality agreements are binding and allow the potential acquirers, this pared down group of acquirers, to get into the real due diligence box and really look at it, run some numbers, and then come back with proposed terms of the acquisition from the buyer's perspective. And then those term sheets will be looked at by the selling party, and they'll kind of decide in their committee, which one do we really want to invite to the party? Do we want to put party 1 and party 5, kind of pit them against each other and tell everybody else they're out? And they'll move on to a harder letter of intent. At that point, you'll really get, you'll get some more diligence going on. You'll get financing issues going on. And by the way, all this while this is working, and I've really moved on to negotiation now, the next slide. While this is working, the buyer is working on capital, is working on debt, right? Is working on getting the resources that are necessary to handle that particular business in that location. They may need to engage local counsel for specific issues if it's a property-related deal locally. If it's a national business and they're going to have a bunch of employees, they're going to hire employment consultants and all kinds of things early on in the process to advise them about which issues are really going to turn into issues that are going to hit the bottom line when we take this over. And those things then turn back into a price negotiation. And we see this in our deals a lot as we go through the diligence process. What we tend to do is we tend to sign up a PSA. We get an LOI done, and there's no confidentiality agreement. I mean, sometimes we do them, but very, very often we don't. A separate confidentiality agreement, and we'll get into some diligence, and then we'll sign up a PSA. We'll negotiate very early on, sign up a PSA for what we refer to in the M&A business is a delayed closing. And it gives us a diligence period where we can say, okay, we found stuff that we don't like, so we're out. That's not unusual in very large acquisitions. In smaller acquisitions, we do what's called sign and close, which we've already entered a confidentiality agreement, so I can't go use your information if I'm the buyer and I'm reviewing all your proprietary stuff. Can't use that, or else I'm going to get sued under the confidentiality agreement. But what I can do is I can negotiate the terms of the PSA, and nobody really has a binding agreement, with one exception, so I'll mention in a second, until we actually sit down at the closing and sign the closing document, which is the live document. And the moment we sign that, we tender the money and we're done. The diligence all gets done under a confidentiality agreement without a binding obligation of either party to buy or sell. That's called a sign and close. So you're almost always smaller deals require less diligence and therefore less investment by the buyer in all of its diligence processes and financing processes and legal fees and accounting fees and everything else that have to be invested to do these acquisitions. So during the negotiation phase, we typically see, as I noted here, additional diligence is undertaken. We develop our financing, our capital stack and the like, and then we get into the formal terms of the acquisition documents. And typically, we'll negotiate the PSA, which is our acquisition form of document. If we're doing something like a realty shares type acquisition like we did last year, we acquired some assets, but really took over under a management contract to manage that process. We'll see those terms negotiated during that phase. In this execution phase, I'd refer to that as the phase between when we sign up an earnest money contract for us, a purchase and sale agreement or an acquisition agreement, and the time that we get to closing. I call that the execution or pre-change in control phase. And during that phase, we have much deeper dive into due diligence the way our business is set up. It's a much deeper dive. In lots of M&A situations, as I said before, you have a confidentiality agreement that's binding on the parties. And typically in those kinds of deals, by the way, just so you know how we fix this, I'm sure a lot of you have this question, well, wait a minute, if you don't have a binding agreement, and even if you have a binding confidentiality agreement, the buyer doesn't know he's going to be able to buy the business, has no assurance he can buy the business. The seller could just sell it to anybody while he's involved in spending hundreds of thousands of dollars doing legal and accounting diligence and everything else. How do you fix that problem? The way we fix that problem is we make the letters of intent that in our deals are generally non-binding. We make the letters of intent partially binding. Now, those letters of intent on those kinds of M&A, business acquisitions tend to be really long. Ours tend to be real short. They're almost just summaries of terms. Those acquisition LOIs tend to be 12, 15 pages. There's lots of substance. There's lots of declarations about what the representations are going to look like in the acquisition, how repricing is going to occur. There's all kinds of elements that we don't include in our deals because our LOIs are basically non-binding. But in this kind of situation I'm talking about where you don't sign a binding negotiated purchase contract, which, by the way, in a large M&A deal, I mean, those of you in the shop think that the number of pages that we produce as lawyers has dramatically increased since Cragle has shown up. I have to tell you quite honestly, I've been involved in deals where the M&A acquisition agreement without the schedules was over 150 pages. Just the agreement itself. And then the schedules were so thick that literally it took binders to put the schedules together. And so I have literally four binders laying next to each other, and that's the PSA. So it depends on the deal, but the way we protect those situations so the seller doesn't go out and sell to somebody is we have a standstill agreement that is binding, a binding term, in the LOI. So not only do we have a binding confidentiality agreement that nobody's talking, we also have a quiet period, a shutdown, where seller cannot go out and offer, can't accept offers, can't engage in a discussion, can't put materials out, nothing. It's a complete standstill. While we're trying to figure out, while we're doing the deep dive into diligence, if we can even get a deal done and negotiate a definitive agreement, a definitive purchase and sale agreement. So that's the way that issue gets handled in those kinds of situations. We don't handle it that way in ours, but that's a typical way to handle that. So you have lots of due diligence going on during this pre-closing period. We have deal term adjustment. We do this all the time in our practice, right? We find out something about the property. We find out rent rolls aren't right. We find out there's an environmental issue. We find out there are contracting issues. Find out there are debt issues. There's any number of things. And we turn around and go back to the seller and say, sorry. We'd love to buy this for what's in the PSA, but we're coming to the end of a due diligence period, and we're just going to say, done, we'll get our earnest money back. We're not going to do this deal on these terms. And we're entitled to do that, right? So we use that diligence process and then the deadline that's coming up as a way to negotiate changes that we think need to be made to make the deal work for us, right? And so in the process, before we get down to the definitive document in this other kind of M&A, larger M&A deal I'm talking about, all that renegotiation occurs before the binding agreement ever gets signed. The final price, final terms, reps and warranties, all that sort of stuff, all gets negotiated out before anybody ever signs anything. And then we get a binding agreement and we're done. And then we close. So let's talk about closing for a second. We've got definitive documents, we've got, and then the parties are now out in the process. Once we have definitive documents and we're headed to a closing, now we're out doing the things that have to be done to get to the close. And that is, we're finalizing forms of assignments and consents. We're going out to third parties who we have to have their consent, or the seller has to have their consent to allow this sale process to occur. It could be contract parties, it could be vendors, suppliers, it could be customers that have binding terms and agreements. Now we're back to diligence again. One of the critical things that has to be done in every acquisition is you have to read through the contracts. somebody has to read through the contracts, every line, and figure out whether there's an unusual clause in there. Let me make one sidebar comment here. I thought about this earlier this morning. I thought I need to make this point, but I didn't include it in any of the materials. And that is, there's lots of times, especially in a sub-industry like multifamily, for example, and Darren would tell you this, that you get into a PSA, a purchase and sale agreement, a negotiation, and the seller's lawyer will say back, or one of the brokers on the other side will say back when you say, well, we don't want to do it this way, we want to do this. And the standard knee-jerk response, and I want to have my knee-jerk at that point and kick that guy that's saying it on the other side, you know where. My knee-jerk, his knee-jerk response is, oh, well, that's not market. Have you ever heard that before, Graham? Yeah. That's not market. Again, if there's anything you hear from me today beyond this, please hear this. There is no acquisition that's standard. They're all different. They're all different. That's why we talk about this. That's why we do the due diligence. That's why we go figure it out. That's why we walk your property, right? They're all different. And so there's nothing standard about any of this. Let me tell you what I'm going to require, that our lender is going to require, that's absolutely the standard, and we're not doing the deal without it. And that is good title, free and clear of all liens, claims, and encumbrances. Right? That's the one standard that we can't give on, don't care about anything else. Now, we probably care about one other thing, and that is you can't lie to me about your rent roll, so don't do that. I need to have that one too, right? But outside of that, lots of the rest of this stuff we can negotiate around. I mean, I've literally been involved in deals where the only representation that was made, because the seller would not make another representation, was good title, free and clear of liens, claims, and encumbrances, period, full stop. That's it. Look, end of the day, as long as I know I have good title, and whether it's a real estate asset or something else, I can risk adjust, figure out what the rest of the risks of your business are, if I'm an expert, and we could price that, and now all we're talking about is the pricing term. We're not talking about the reps and warranties. So if you ever hear somebody come back to you and say, well, that's not standard, right, because this deal is not standard. So let's just talk, okay? Let's stop saying that it's not standard. That doesn't get us anywhere. We've got an issue. Let's deal with it, right? So anyway, that's what happens in the process. This is a negotiation opportunity, and we renegotiate, and on we go. And ultimately, if we're successful, we get to a closing, thank goodness. And sometimes, by the way, the best decisions we ever make is not to close and walk. I've had a number of very successful entrepreneurs over the years tell me that the most important decisions they made in their careers were to walk away from deals, not do a deal, right, in retrospect. So it's okay. It's okay for us to discover things that we didn't think we were going to discover and say, all right, done. We're not doing that one. We're not going to find a way to force the round peg into the square hole. Let's move on. Important stuff. Ultimately, we get to a closing. We deliver definitive documents, deeds, assignments, contract rights, all those sorts of things. For us, the critical one tends to be the deed. We've got loan documents, obviously, in our stuff. In almost every M&A, you're going to have loan documents. There's going to be a third-party financing party that provides significant financing to the M&A acquirer, and then they provide their own equity. Lots of times, the PE groups are providing their own big tranche of equity into the deal, and then they'll buy 70, 80, or 90% of the equity in the deal, lots of times, and make the sellers hold on to 10% as a tail to make sure they have commitment from the sellers, that they're not just going to walk away from the business, that the relationships will stay on, and that there will be a transitional effort to try to help the business not only survive, but get better post-closing, which now brings us to the next slide, and that is integration. So what happens post-closing? We've now had a closing, money changed hands, documents changed hands, and guess what? You now own the baby. Now what do you do? As I said earlier on, this is the hardest part of acquisition work, is actually integrating, and good integration firms or companies that are good at integrating are looking during the diligence period, like we do all the time, at what the accounting work looks like from the get-go on the other side, what systems they're using, what data formats they have, what computer systems are being used and the like, because all that somehow or another has to transition into and work inside of our systems, or we're going to have a bunch of disparate systems and then there's lots of manual work. Is there anybody here from RREAF Residential? Yeah, you guys in the accounting department at RREAF Residential, you guys constantly having to transition data, right? Transition data over. Again, it's one of the hardest things that happens in an acquisition is the transition of data. Obviously, I have transition of management policies, employees. One of the things that we handle here when we acquire a new business, we set up all new bank accounts. Depending upon how what that property looks like. For example, sometimes these HUD properties, they already have large reserves, and the reserve account has to stay the same. It can't move to another bank or those sorts of things. You'll see those kinds of things happen in M&A work all the time, where even though we want all that reserve money to move somewhere else, a lender dictates that it stays wherever it is, and so the acquirer has to go create an account at that new financial institution where they don't have a relationship. Typically don't want to do that. It's uncomfortable. You know how you work. Your banker knows how you work, but lots of times that's required. So that's part of this transitional effort. So, and then beyond that, we've got to, obviously implement new policies. Lots of times, this is sort of one of the unsung issues in these deals, is when you have new staff come over and they've been with, and the RREAF Residential folks are really the key point for us in this. When we have staff come over from an existing property or portfolio of properties from a prior management company, and they come into the RREAF Residential group, it can be a period of time before those managers understand how we work and what they need to be doing it differently from the way they've done it before. Difficult. It's transitional education, and that can be very difficult. And then finally, ultimately, what we're trying to get to in every deal we do is this final phase, and that is operations. I call that stabilized operations. We want to get through this transitional period. Obviously, we take over operations immediately after closing, but we have some transitional period where we're trying to transition the organization into the fold and dovetail it with what we do. When that's all sort of said and done, what we're really doing at that point now is operating and trying to get it to stabilize, operate, and then maybe grow from there. At least that's the model. So those are the overarching things you'll see in every deal you ever do. Those of you that get in and out of our side of the shop over there, you won't always see us doing real estate deals. We have other deals that are going on that we're asked to work on, both inside and outside RREAF. And so if you have any interest in seeing sometimes what some of those look like, come by and ask. I'm happy to talk you through what that one looks like, because it's not real estate. It's different. It's a different deal. And then one final point, and that is, we really have three platforms. We have hospitality. We've got hospitality and multifamily, and then we have what we call ground up. So, and those of you that are anywhere near the ground up space know that that is a completely different animal unto itself. I don't care if we're buying or building a ground up hospitality asset that ultimately is going to be considered part of our hospitality portfolio, or we're building a multifamily complex that's ultimately going to be part of the multifamily portfolio. That ground up process is an entirely different process, one that requires completely different expertise. This kind of checklist that you're looking at here on an acquisition checklist doesn't work at all. It's not even in the game. And so we have to see that completely differently. That's also a deal. They're just a different anatomy. It looks like it's a different body structure from what we see in our acquisitions of multifamily, of existing businesses. Okay? So that's sort of anatomy of a deal from the top.